Emancipation Day and Civil War Day here at the Lumpkins Jail and Richmond's African Burial Ground site. My name is Anna Edwards and I'm with the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, and I am your MC for today. Lois Levine, Dr. Lois Levine is a scholar, author, and I interviewed her on my show actually last summer. And we had a very good conversation about Mary Bowser. And Mary Bowser, as many people know, was a formerly enslaved woman who was educated and became a spy in the White House of the Confederacy, working side by side, as it were, with the President of the Confederacy and passing on the information that she gleaned from her work there on a daily basis for several years during the war. Dr. Levine has done tremendous amounts of research into Mary Bowser's history and that of her employer, former owner, and cohort in the espionage work of the Civil War for the Union Army. And she has written a book called The Secrets of Mary Bowser, and I can tell you from firsthand testimony that it is one of the most exciting reads of historical fiction that I've had in a long time. So with no more words, I'd like to welcome Dr. Levine to the stage so that she can tell you herself about the journey to make this book.
I am so honored and so awed to be here, to be in Richmond, and to talk a little bit about Mary's story, especially on a day where citywide you're thinking about this history, and especially in this particular place to think about this history. Just the idea of the future of Richmond's past, that we need to look back in order to move forward, I think is really very powerful. Is this in the right place? I feel like it's, I don't know what relationship I have to it. So yeah, you can probably tell from the sound of my voice that I am not from Virginia. And you may also have noticed that I am white. And I'm here to tell you because there's a black woman from Virginia who changed my life and changed the lives of a lot of other people whose names we don't know. But I want to tell her enough about her so that maybe she'll change your life a little bit too. When I was in graduate school, I read a big book of black women's history, 300 pages, and in those 300 pages were about 3 paragraphs that told me about Mary Bowser. It said Mary Bowser was born into slavery in Richmond, Virginia. She was freed by Bet Van Loo, the daughter of the family that owned her, and sent to the north to be educated. But then Mary made the rather unusual choice of coming back to the south, to Richmond, where during the war she became a spy for the Union by pretending to be a slave in the Confederate White House. This kind of blew my mind. Now, you may have heard this story before, or it may be news to you, but it is kind of a mind-blowing story. And so I set out to imagine what her life was like. I wanted to be able to tell this story to more people. Okay, thanks. So I started to sort of imagine what her life would be like here. Now, I knew a lot. I was teaching and writing about slavery, but most of what I knew about slavery was about plantation slavery, which is generally what we know most about. In Richmond, the life of the enslaved population was very different because Richmond was urban and industrial. So in the period right before the Civil War, 1 out of every 5 blacks in the city was free. Now, if you were enslaved on a plantation, you didn't really have much contact with free black people. But if you were living in Richmond, you would have contact with the free black population. Many of the slaves who worked in Richmond were skilled laborers. They were working at foundries or at tobacco factories. So again, their lives were very different. And often you might be a hired out slave, right? So I mean, the family that owned me might live in Tidewater, Virginia, but I would live here away from them. Usually it was men who were hired out to do this kind of skilled labor. But it meant that you had more distance from the people who owned you, and you might be able to decide where in the city you lived. You might even be able to decide who you worked for year to year, as long as the bulk of your wages got paid back to the person who owned you. As some of you may know, First African Baptist Church was an all-black church in Richmond that right before the Civil War had 3,000 members in it. So that's a big church by today's standards, right? A 3,000 people church, that's a lot for a church. 3,000 black people, free and slave, coming together in worship in a city where it was illegal for more than 5 black people to get together, right? So a very strange and different experience. But at the same time, Richmond was also one of the slave trading capitals of the United States, second only to New Orleans. So $4 million a year was the money that went into the slave trade in the city. And as a black person, whether you were free or enslaved, as you walked through the city, you would see slave jails, auction houses, slave prisons. And so trying to imagine what it would be like, not just during the years of the Civil War, but during Mary's childhood, to grow up enslaved, but yet by a family that somehow seemed to see her as different and exceptional, because she was the one slave who was freed and sent north to be educated, but also to have to contend with the violence of slavery every day just in sites like this around the city. So I wanted to read you a couple of scenes from the novel. And again, Mary's life was extraordinary, but like the lives of many people, particularly women and particularly African Americans and particularly slaves, not particularly well documented. So to try and tell her story, I pulled from many sources, but I had to imagine a great deal. So I don't know anything, we don't know anything conclusive about her parents, but I invent who they might have been. So we do know that she was owned from her earliest childhood by the Van Loos. She would have served in their house as a house slave. So in my invented universe, her mother is also a house slave to the Van Loos. Her father, in my invented universe, because I wanted readers to understand about hired out slaves, about skilled laborers, her father is a blacksmith. He's also a slave, but he's owned by somebody else. He's owned by a blacksmith in the city. So Mary and her mother get to see him one day a week, and the rest of the time they're living with the Van Loo family. Because I wanted people to understand how rich and diverse the enslaved community was, in the way I tell her story, her mother is from New York, and people tend to forget that there was slavery in the North well into the 19th century. So I know that Bet Van Loo's father had come from New York and moved to Richmond, and I add to that story, that fact, the idea that Mary's mother was a slave who was given by the Van Loo family in New York to their son as a going away present, which was something that would happen, right? So she was sent away from her community. But being from New York, she's literate, which was much rarer for slaves in Virginia. So there's a little bit of background. In the scene I'm going to read, and the scene is told from Mary's point of view, you'll meet Mary, you'll meet her mother, whom she calls Mama, and who the Van Loos call Aunt Minnie. You'll also meet Bet Van Loo. Now, Bet is somebody who is eventually, years later, going to free Mary, have her educated, and eventually be part of the same underground spy ring. But you will see that Bet, although her heart is in the right place, does not always say or do exactly what you might wish she would. So keep an eye on her in this scene. You're also going to meet Bet's mother, Mistress Van Loo, who clearly stands in for a whole larger world of what it is like to be a slave owner. As I read this scene, think about the fact that every child wants to believe that he or she is special, and Mary is still a child in this scene. Every parent wants to believe that their child is special. But when you are enslaved, being special is a very dangerous thing. And you will, I hope, see the moment when you think, this is why she wanted to read this scene in this particular spot. When early spring warmed the Virginia morning, Mistress Van Loo and Miss Bet took their breakfast on the back veranda. The garden just past the house, the fruit arbor that sloped to the edge of the property, and the view of Richmond and the James River beyond were all so pretty that looking out at them seemed like a hazy slumber dream, until a dull ache in my overworked arms roused me from my reverie. As I fanned the first flies of the season from the Van Loos, they buzzed around my head instead. I didn't dare swat them away. I'd been told enough times not to wriggle or shift during these meals, to stand perfectly still except for the movement of my arms. No motion allowed except what served the Van Loos. To distract myself, I listened as Miss Bet read to her mother from the newspaper. Most days, she chose dull stories about the Virginia legislature or President Polk. But this morning, She read the report of a dashing swindler who posed as a gentleman to rob travelers on the train between Richmond and Washington. Such a story set my 8-year-old self wide-eyed with wonder, and I hung on every word. More than that, I remembered every word. This was my solitary amusement, listening as grown-ups spoke and repeating their conversations to myself while I was working. Rehearsing the tale of the train robber in my head made the rest of the Van Nuys breakfast hour pass quickly. And before I knew it, Mistress Van Loo announced she was ready to take her morning stroll about the arbor. As Miss Bet led her mother down the steps to the garden, Mama gathered the breakfast things onto the silver serving tray. I hung the fan in its place behind one of the white columns that rose 2 stories to the veranda roof. Clearing the news sheet from the table, I began to recite the wonderful story out loud. The crash of china startled me. Mama was not a clumsy woman, never one to drop a cup and saucer. Perhaps it was a trick of the heat, but as I turned to look her way, it seemed the whole world stood still, except for me and the buzzing flies. And then, all at once, Mistress Van Loo stormed back up the steps. "Aunt Minnie, we are not in New York. You know the laws of Virginia, and we have made our wishes very clear on this matter. You are not to teach the child to read." Mama fell to her knees. "Ma'am, I never taught her to read. I swear to Jesus I didn't." Mistress Van Loo knew Mama wasn't one to swear to Jesus falsely. Our irate mistress turned to her daughter. "Bet, this abolitionist nonsense of yours has gone too far. How you have managed it, I do not know, but now at least you see your faith in the servants is poorly placed. The girl may know how to read, but she does not know enough to keep your secrets. Perhaps sending Mary to Lumpkin's Alley will teach you both a lesson." Fear cramped my stomach, catching its echo in Mama's low moan. White Richmond called the public whipping post Lumpkin's Alley, after the slave auction house next door. But to colored folks, it was Devil's Half-Acre, the most dreaded spot in the whole city. Miss Bet jutted out her chin. "I am not sorry to see a slave learn, but this is as strange to me as it is to you. If you have the child whipped to punish me for something I haven't done, you will only prove that slavery is every bit as evil as I believe it to be." Mistress Van Loo whirled at me, cracking a hard slap against my cheek. I felt the sudden sting and knew it was a pale promise of the beating I'd get at the whipping post. "Who taught you to read, child? I will stand no lies." "No one, ma'am. I don't know how to read." Mama was so near, yet I sensed she didn't dare reach out to comfort me, that I needed to say more to make Mistress Van Loo leave us be. "Miss Bet read the story to you. I only remembered what she said." Mistress Van Loo snatched the news sheet from my hand and passed it to her daughter. "Tell us now, without the paper, what Miss Bet read." And so I repeated the story, as Miss Bet followed along in the news sheet. After only a few sentences, she burst out, "Mother, it is remarkable. The child recites the article word for word. She wasn't reading at all. Stranger than that, she can recall exactly what she hears." Mistress Van Loo spent a long moment considering what this meant. Finally, she looked from me to Mama to Miss Bet. "No one is to know of this. Do I make myself clear to all of you? This is a dangerous thing. Do not speak of it again." She went into the mansion, leaving each of us to make our own sense of what I'd done. Despite the law and Mistress Van Loo's prohibition, after that morning on the veranda, Mama set time aside every Sunday for my lessons. She'd trace out a few words in the ashes of Papa's fireplace. Keeping her voice low, she always began, "This being Virginia, I sure can't teach a slave what this writing means." And then she'd finish by saying what she'd written. It didn't take any more instruction than that for me to learn to read and write. Miss Bet, eager to flout her mother, took her own interest in me. As I grew older, she pressed books from her father's library on Mama, nodding my way. Now and again, she even sat me down for an arithmetic lesson while the rest of her family was out. But my memory for Mistress Van Loo's anger was just as keen as my memory for what I heard and read. I hated her for it, until I realized the lesson she taught me was as valuable as any of Mama's. A slave best keep her talents hidden, feigned ignorance being the greatest intelligence in the topsy-turvy house of bondage. So I like the idea that being a slave is actually the perfect training for being a spy. For people who lived under slavery, you had to live a double life. You were told you were one thing when you knew you were something else. You were told there were things you had to do you were always trying not to do. They were told that there were things that you weren't allowed to do you were always trying to do. So I like the idea that learning to live surreptitiously, that the very thing that enabled people to survive under slavery would then be so powerful when she became a spy during the war. And I think that one of the things that is really hard for those of us who write and teach about this very troubled moment in America's past is that you're always trying to strike a balance. You want, on the one hand, to be able to convey and for us to understand the dehumanizing nature of slavery as an institution, right? It literally denied that blacks were human. And it did that in many, many different ways, small and large, to dehumanize, to dehumanize, to dehumanize. And you want to represent that, and we can't forget that. But on the other hand, there are also the many ways in which enslaved people retained and sustained their humanity, the way that people preserved themselves and their families and their communities. And so it is always a balance to try and remember both of those things. I was up at the Museum of the Confederacy, which of course is in the Confederate White House, yesterday, and we're going to have a panel talking more about Mary Bowser this afternoon there. But I was there and I met a very interesting man named T.C. Milner who works with teens, and he said to me, well, so after we talked about Mary Bowser for a while, he said, so tell me, what do you think history is? What do we really mean when we say history? And that kind of sent me reeling, even though I talk about history every day. And I think that history is, on the one hand, and we feel this really in the shadow of Lumpkins, my friend who is taking me around today said, every time I come to this place, I don't want to be here. I don't want to feel what I have to feel in this space. So on the one hand, history is about a brutality that horrifies us, but it is also about the strength that sustains us. And there's another section of the novel that I have never read in public before, but I really feel like I want to read it here. And I should say that the story starts with Mary in her childhood because I wanted people to understand that perspective, how her parents care for her, but also that when you get your freedom, it often meant that you were leaving something behind. So the cost of her freedom is having to leave her family and her community. In the middle section of the novel, she's in Philadelphia and she gets to go to school. And it's a wonderful opportunity, but she also realizes that freedom is not the same as equality. And even in the Quaker City, there is plenty of racism. Discrimination is legal in education, employment, housing. So what does that mean? And then, of course, that her freedom doesn't mean the same thing when 4 million other people are still enslaved. So she comes back to Richmond, and then we get to the third section of the novel, where finally the Civil War, those who signed up for the spy in the Confederate White House are finally get what interests them in this novel. But one of the interesting things about writing this is I'm a public school kid from suburbia. Mary had a private girls' school education, so she actually ends up better educated than I am. She can speak Latin. I had to learn enough Latin to fake it, to tell her story. And I say that because that's going to actually come up in this section of the novel. This happens at a moment when she's just come back to Richmond, so the war hasn't started yet. And of course, she lives most of her life on Churchill. Am I pointing in the right direction? Which way is Churchill from here? Okay, that's good. That was my instinct, but I really have no idea where I am. So she lives most of her life on Churchill, and if you know anything about the geography of antebellum Richmond, there and here were very different places. So she needs to get a message to somebody on the other side of the city, and this is her experience just walking through this part of the city to get from Churchill over to Shacko Hill. In the 7 blocks beyond the Vanloo mansion, Churchill slopes down into the Shacko ravine. Most streets dead end against the creek, starting up again on the other side. Traveling by foot or cart or carriage, you have to pick your way across by heading some ways upstream or downstream to one of the rickety bridges that traverse the creek bottom. Residents of Churchill always spoke about Shacko Hill, which rises up from the far side of the creek, as if it were a foreign land. Since I never had business at Court End or Capitol Square, I had scant sense of the Richmond that stretched west of the creek. Making my way toward Chaco Hill, I had to pass through the long blocks of slave pens and auction houses that constituted Richmond's topographical and moral low point. Alejandro's slave jail was right on Broad Street. So were smaller slave traders like Fodrin's and Frazier's. Clustered on side streets off Broad all the way to the canal were more than a dozen similar establishments, Lumpkin's Alley the worst of them. Little wonder colored Richmond called the area Devil's Half-Acre. The white men gathered outside the slave pen looked me over just as though I were standing half-stripped on the auction block. I silently remembered the passage from the Stoic philosopher Seneca that I translated my first year in Miss Maps's class. I'm not going to try and read the Latin. I'm going to go right into the translation. You say he is a slave, but he is a person with a free spirit. You say he is a slave, but show me who is not a slave. One man is a slave to his lusts, another is a slave to greed, another a slave of ambition, and all are slaves to hope and fear. I told myself that the men ogling me were slaves to lust, greed, ambition, hope, and fear all together. They saw me only as an ignorant slave, but surely that was better than being a slave trader who chose ignorance for himself. So I think about what really drew me to Mary's story, and that was part of it, is what would it be like to have the opportunity to be educated that she had, and then live year after year among people who saw her as completely, not just not having that opportunity, but incapable of being educated. There's a difference between being uneducated and being ignorant in the sense of being incapable of being educated. There are many people who don't have the opportunity to be educated, but that doesn't mean that they're not intelligent, and we can't mistake those things for one for the other. But just thinking about what it would be like to walk this space, as I know we do in many ways in Richmond, and I know that there's going to be a walk tonight as well. And what does it mean to walk in the footsteps of these folks who were here before? So I don't know that I have much else that I want to say, except that I think it's worth remembering Mary Bowser and the many other enslaved people who were always vibrant in their humanity despite the dehumanizing institution of slavery. But the way that they sustained and survived and helped to rid this nation of this terrible, terrible thing that was chattel slavery, it sort of is incredible to be back here and thinking about Mary and getting to tell her story again. So, and I have no idea how much time I've taken, or if we have more time and people have questions. I'm doing okay? Yeah. Oh, we have a little time, so yeah. Do people have questions or comments? Yes.
I was just wondering if you had a chance to talk to any of her descendants.
So this was a question about whether I have talked to any of her descendants. There's at least one family in the DC area that think of her as a direct ancestor who contacted me, so I've heard from them. And I know that there are other folks in Richmond who I have not necessarily had contact with. But this is very tricky because we don't, what did I say about how poorly documented people's lives were? There's no direct documentation of her having any children. So this is one of those things where what the historical record tells us as opposed to what people know from family history can be very different. And it's, there's a man named Nate Huggins who's one of the first professors of African American studies at Harvard. And he was once asked to reflect on the Sally Hemings, the rumors that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson had had children together. And he said, you know, that story is symbolically true, even if it isn't literally true, because it gives black people a place at the founding of the nation. Now, Nate Huggins died in the late 1980s, before we had the DNA testing that we have today. So now we know that what was symbolically true actually was also literally true in that case, right? But then I think it tells us something about how this story stays in people's families and stays in an oral tradition, these kinds of stories much more. And so we were talking earlier today and somebody said, you know, Well, my family, we tell stories about maybe this person that we're descended from, maybe she also passed information, or maybe Mary gathered information from other slaves around the city. And we're probably not ever going to know that for sure, but I don't think that this is the story of somebody who was so exceptional because she was the only one who did it. So I always want to honor the stories that come out of people's families, or honor the people who feel a family connection to Mary Bowser, even if census records aren't going to tell us that, or even if the history, the U.S. military records aren't going to tell us that, but we have to remember the history where it's come from. But if you know any descendants who want to get in touch, put them in touch. I'm interested.
She's honored by the United States Army. 1995, she got a commendation.
Right, so there's a comment that the Army has commended Mary. She's also on the CIA website, which kind of blows my mind. Like, the CIA wants to have their multi-culti moment, and they find this black woman who's fine before there was a CIA, but that's okay, they will take her as an honorary CIA agent. Yeah, and I mean, this is interesting because either you've never heard about Mary Bowser, or look, there are all these places that are interested in her. And so that question about is she a CIA, is she a military hero? She certainly never served in the military. Now, I will say nearly 200,000 black men did serve in the United States Colored Troops, as they were called. And the film Glory, which is a good film, has made people aware of that, but people seem to think that the Massachusetts 54th was the unit. Almost 200,000 black men served. So there are, again, many, many, many other stories to tell. And increasingly, we can access those records as things become digitized. You can, as I have done, you can go to the National Archives and look at the pension records from the USCT and find not just the story of the men who served, but what their lives were like in the period after the war. But you can also start doing some of this research. Well, you have the Library of Virginia, you have great sources here, but also digitally we get to do much more of this research that way. Yeah.
Anything interesting? Could you give us one story about her in the Confederate White House doing her thing?
Right, doing her thing. So this is what's frustrating. We don't know very much, although I recently found a new document related to her in November that she was speaking in Brooklyn. Why hadn't I thought to look for her in Brooklyn? I don't know. But she spoke in Brooklyn in September of 1865, so not long after the war. And there's a newspaper account from a reporter who was there, and he says she came with letters of introduction from and lists a bunch of generals. So it is possible that I or some enterprising history graduate student, if you are out there, I welcome you, could go and try and look through their correspondence and find more details. I did, one of the curators up at the White House of the Confederacy took me on a little private tour through the house, and I had done a tour of the house many years ago. The one other time I was in Richmond was when I was just thinking about writing this book. And so it was kind of interesting to move through that space again and realize, like, oh yes, the red decanter, that I put that in a scene, or the way that the spaces relate to each other and put it in a scene. I think we really want like that particular nugget, and it's hard because we won't know. And I'll say this again at the panel at MOC in a few minutes, but I often feel like Bette Van Loo's life is far better documented for lots of reasons, mostly that people who had more money, their lives were better documented, right? So we know a lot more about what Bette did, and often the strangest things in the book, the most unbelievable things, are things that Bette Van Loo did. And so my job is to figure out, when Bette Van Loo decides that the Union colonel, who was Colonel Dahlgren, was leading a raid against Richmond, and the Confederates kill him, and then she feels that the way they buried him was not honorable enough. So Bette finds out where he's buried and goes and digs him up secretly, and then secretly reburies him. We know that, but we don't know where Mary was. So I get to decide, what does Mary think when she's watching this white lady do that, right? Mary's thinking, we really need to keep things on the down low. I'm not sure that should be the place that we're placing our attention and our energy. So often the historical incidents don't necessarily come directly from what we know about Mary, but the interesting part for me is thinking about what it would mean to Mary at that moment and what does she do. Any other questions? Yeah.
Born Mary Richard and then Mary Bowser.
Yes, so this is the place where the historical Mary and the Mary whose life I envision here are separate. We know that in the early part of her life she used the last name Mary Richards. We don't know why she used that name, and there's Van Loo cousins whose last name is Richards, so I don't know whether whether she belonged to that family or what that, or her parents did. We don't know anything about any of that. She becomes Mary Bowser by marriage, and I always say the only spoiler that people know about the book is the North Winds. Sorry. So I won't say any more about how she marries or who she marries or how it works in the book. But the person that she marries is the person who the historical Mary married. Any more? All right. Well, Carolyn is ready to applaud and gong me off the stage, and I do what she tells me. I think there are copies of the book here, and I'm happy to sign, or if you have your own, I'm happy to sign, or if you just want to talk more about Mary Bowser, I'm always happy to talk more about Mary Bowser. Thank you so much, and I hope that you continue to have a great day.
Well, she took my line. I was going to reiterate that she is signing books, and the books are only $15, and it's cash only. And if they sell out here, that more will be available at the afternoon program at the Museum of the Confederacy.
And it's at Target. Tell them that it's at Target.
And it's at Target.
You can buy Richmond's Black Civil War history at Target. I love that.
All right, very good.